Imagine looking at a map of Australia and seeing three different countries where one nation now stands. A Dutch Australia in the west, a French Australia along the south, a British Australia clinging to the east. Different flags, different languages, different armies, borders cutting across deserts, rivers, and ancient lands. It sounds impossible now, but for a long time, Australia sat at the edge of a dangerous European race. Dutch sailors reached parts of its coast first. French ships arrived when Britain was trying to secure its place. And Britain, frightened of losing the continent to a rival, moved faster and harder until nearly all of it was painted red on imperial maps. But there's a truth that makes this story darker from the very first second. Australia was not an empty prize waiting for Europe. For at least 65,000 years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had lived across this vast continent. They knew the seasons, the water holes, the stars, the paths of animals, the dangers of sea and desert. Hundreds of peoples, languages, laws, and trading networks already existed here. So this is not a story about Europe discovering a blank land. It is a story about distant empires looking at living country and seeing only space on a map. And the strangest part is this. There was never a signed agreement saying, let us divide Australia 3 ways. No neat master plan. No official line drawn from coast to coast. The danger was more real than that. It came through small decisions. A ship that turned left instead of right. A captain who saw a coastline and sailed away. A French expedition appearing at exactly the wrong moment. A British governor who knew that one rival settlement could change the future of an entire continent. 3 European powers came close enough to shape a different Australia. The first was the Netherlands. In the early 1600s, Dutch ships ruled the sea routes between Europe and Asia. Their merchants wanted spices, silk, coffee, porcelain, and profit. Their ships sailed across oceans where a wrong wind could mean death. In 1606, a Dutch captain named Willem Janszoon sailed into waters near the northern edge of Australia. His small ship was called the Duifkin, meaning little dove. There was nothing gentle about the voyage. The Duifkin came through heat, storms, sickness, hunger, and the constant fear of wrecking on reefs nobody in Europe had ever mapped. Then Janszoon reached the coast near the Gulf of Carpentaria, on the Cape York Peninsula. He did not know he was standing near the edge of a continent that would one day be called Australia. He thought he had found part of New Guinea. Still, his journey mattered. It was the first recorded European mapping of part of the Australian mainland. That should have changed everything. The Dutch were powerful. Their East India Company was one of the richest organizations on earth. They had ships, money, ports, soldiers, and experience building colonies across Asia. If any European power had the ability to plant a Dutch flag on Australia first, it was them. And for decades, Dutch vessels kept finding the western and northern edges of the continent. In 1616, Dirk Hartog reached an island off the coast of Western Australia. He left behind a metal plate, recording his visit. It was a small object, but it carried a huge warning. The Dutch were here. They were mapping these waters. They were leaving their mark. Later came Abel Tasman, the navigator whose name still survives in Tasmania. In 1642, Tasman reached the island he named Van Diemen's Land. In 1644, he explored more of the north coast. Dutch maps began to show a vast southern land called New Holland. For a moment, it must have seemed as though the West belonged to the Dutch before Britain had even entered the story. But then came the first great twist. The Dutch did not settle it. They had no sustained plan to conquer a continent whose vast interior was unknown to them, and no reason then to risk men and ships for land they could not easily use. Why? Partly because this coast looked harsh and dangerous to sailors who wanted quick trade. There were reefs, dry shores, fierce weather, and long distances from the Dutch bases in Indonesia. Dutch captains were searching for useful ports, profitable goods, and safe routes. What they often found was a coastline that frightened them. The wreck of the Batavia in 1629 became a nightmare people remembered. The Dutch ship struck the Abrolhos Islands off Western Australia. What followed was shipwreck, fear, murder, and horror among survivors stranded far from help. To Dutch sailors, New Holland could begin to feel less like a treasure chest and more like a place that punished anyone who came too close. And there was another problem. The Dutch already had something they valued more. Indonesia. The Dutch East India Company was focused on controlling the spice trade. The islands of Southeast Asia offered ports, crops, people, and routes that connected directly to massive wealth. Australia, at least from the limited coast the Dutch saw, did not seem to offer the same prize. So Dutch maps carry the name New Holland. Dutch ships reached its shores. Dutch explorers came first, but they did not build the towns. They did not bring large armies. They did not create a permanent Dutch colony. History turned on that absence, because when one empire walks away, another begins to look closer. More than 100 years later, Britain entered the picture. But even Britain was not first. In 1770, Lieutenant James Cook sailed up the east coast aboard the Endeavour. He claimed that coast for Britain and called it New South Wales. The image is famous. A British flag, a distant shore, a new possession for the crown. But that moment was not the beginning of Australia, and it was not complete control. Cook had claimed the east coast, not the whole continent. Most of the interior was still unknown to Europeans. The west carried Dutch names. The south had not been fully mapped, and across the sea, France was watching. Britain had just suffered a deep wound. It had lost the American colonies. For an empire, that was more than embarrassment. It was a shock to trade, power, prestige, and military strategy. Britain needed places to send convicts. It needed ports in the Pacific. It needed to show its rivals that it was still strong. Australia began to look useful. Then, in January 1788, the first fleet arrived at Botany Bay. Convicts, Marines, officers, supplies, tired faces after months at sea. They soon moved to Sydney Cove, where the British colony of New South Wales began. But just days later, another shape appeared on the horizon. A French ship. It was the expedition of Jean-François de Galaup, better known as La Pérouse. Think about the tension of that moment. Britain had only just planted itself on the edge of this vast continent. The settlement was weak. The food was uncertain. The people were exhausted. And now a French expedition had sailed into Botany Bay. France and Britain were old rivals. They had fought wars across Europe, North America, India, and the oceans. They competed for colonies, trade routes, and naval power. To British eyes, a French ship at Botany Bay was not simply a visitor. It was a warning. La Pérouse did not establish a French colony there. His mission was one of exploration and science. But timing matters in history. The French arrival showed Britain something frightening. France could reach Australia too. And if France could reach it, France could return. The British settlement at Sydney was still fragile, but it had now become more than a convict camp. It was a stake in a continental struggle. Then France came back in an even more dramatic way. In 1800, during the age of Napoleon, French captain Nicolas Baudin set sail with two ships, the Geographe and the Naturalist. His expedition carried scientists, artists, officers, and sailors. Their task was to study and chart the coast of Australia. The French were not just chasing land. They were collecting plants, animals, drawings, measurements, and information. They wanted knowledge, and knowledge could become power. Every bay placed on a map, every safe harbor identified, every stretch of coast named. It all mattered. At the same time, Britain had sent its own man to map the continent. His name was Matthew Flinders. Flinders was young, determined, and racing against uncertainty. He knew the French were somewhere in these waters. He knew that maps were not just paper. Maps were claims waiting to happen. Then in April 1802, it happened. Two enemy nations met at sea beside the southern coast of Australia. Flinders, aboard the Investigator, saw the French ships. Baudin saw the British vessel. For a moment, both sides had to wonder what the other was really doing. Were they scientists? Were they scouts? Were they measuring a future colony? The two captains met peacefully. Flinders later named the place Encounter Bay. It sounds calm now, but beneath that polite meeting was the pressure of empire. France and Britain were at war in Europe. Their ships had crossed the world, and there they were, face to face at the edge of a continent neither side fully controlled. Imagine if Baudin had carried orders to plant a permanent French settlement in the south. Imagine if France had claimed a major port before Britain could reach it. Australia might not have become one British colony stretching across the continent. It might have become a divided land, with French towns along the southern coast and British settlements in the east. And the West? The West was still a haunting question. The Dutch had named it New Holland. Their maps had made it visible to Europe. Britain had settlements in the east, but its hold on the far west was thin. That gap created fear. For years, British officials worried that another European power might use the western coast. France was the most obvious danger. A French base on the west coast could threaten British shipping routes and weaken Britain's position in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. So Britain began to act with a different kind of urgency. In 1826, British soldiers established a small settlement at King George Sound, near present-day Albany in Western Australia. It was not a grand city. It was a remote outpost at the edge of the known world. But its purpose was enormous. Britain wanted to make sure France did not get there first. 3 years later, in 1829, the Swan River Colony was founded near present-day Perth. Britain was no longer satisfied with holding the East. It wanted the West too. That was the decisive move. By building settlements and sending officials, Britain turned loose claims into control. It was not just placing flags on maps now. It was creating ports, roads, forts, farms, laws, and colonial governments. The old possibility began to disappear. Dutch Australia never rose in the West. French Australia never took root in the South. Britain pushed its reach further and further until the continent was drawn into one British imperial system. But now we come to the part of the story that old maps often hide. Every time a European captain claimed a coast, he was claiming land that belonged to someone else. The Dutch did not find an empty western shore. The British did not arrive in a land without people. The French did not sail through silent waters. They entered a continent filled with nations who had lived there for countless generations. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had names for places long before Europeans made their own maps. They had responsibilities to country. They had laws, ceremonies, kinship systems, trade networks, and knowledge passed down through generations. For them, the arrival of European empires was not a game of flags. It was invasion. And once Britain decided it must control the whole continent, the cost fell on the people already living there. Land was taken. Communities were pushed away. Languages were damaged. Families suffered violence, disease, displacement, and loss. The empire that united Australia did so by breaking many older worlds apart. That is the real shadow behind this story. Britain did not simply win a contest against France and the Netherlands. It imposed a new order on country that had never been empty and had never been waiting to be owned. Still, the question remains, how close did Australia truly come to division? Not as close as a Hollywood film might make it seem. There was no Dutch plan to conquer the West. There was no French army ready to split the continent in two. There was no formal three-way deal. But the possibility was real enough to shape British decisions. The Dutch arrived first and left their name across the map. The French explored at a time when Britain feared rivals everywhere. Britain built settlements because it understood a hard rule of empire: the power that stays usually wins. That is why Australia looks the way it does today. Not because Britain was first. It was not. Not because Britain knew the land best. It did not. Britain won because it came back, built, claimed, defended, and refused to leave room for anyone else. Now imagine the other version of history. A Dutch-speaking city on the Swan River. French streets along the southern coast. British colonies in Sydney and Hobart. Border posts across the desert. 3 governments arguing over railways, rivers, trade, and military power. Would there even be one country called Australia? Would people in Perth think of themselves as Dutch Australian? Would Adelaide have become a French port city? Would the eastern colonies have built a separate nation under Britain? The map we know feels inevitable only because we were born after the struggle ended. But it was never inevitable. Australia was shaped by accidents, fears, rivalries, shipwrecks, storms, and moments when one empire moved while another hesitated. And beneath all of it was an older truth. Before the Dutch, before the French, before the British, there was country. There were peoples whose connection to this land reached back beyond every European crown, beyond every map, and beyond every flag planted in the sand. That is why this history matters. It is not only a story about who almost owned Australia. It is a story about how power can redraw a map while trying to erase the people who were there first. So what do you think? Would Australia be a stronger, more interesting place today if the Dutch, French, and British had each taken a part of it? Or would 3 European colonies have created an even more divided and violent future? Share your thoughts in the comments. And subscribe for more forgotten stories that shaped Australia long before Australia became the country we know today.